Welcome, folks, here to a wonderful talk that we're going to have about a cutting-edge human rights issue in the world, not just in mental health, but really in the whole issue of human rights. I'm David Oakes, Director of MindFreedom International. This is my 35th year as a grassroots community organizer in human rights for people who've been diagnosed with mental disabilities. I am a survivor of involuntary psychiatric drugging inside of an institution. That's where, when I was a college student, I had some severe problems. I was put in an institution and experienced several times where I was pressured, pushed to be on psych drugs and actually held down and given that injection. You often see it in the movies. Somebody gets, quote, hysterical, they run in and they give an injection. When you're on the sharp end of the needle, as several of us here have been, it can be a really overwhelming, devastating experience, a profound intrusion into really the core aspects of our being. What we're talking about today is an intersection of that kind of forced drugging, but out in the community, in people's homes. That kind of trauma of forced drugging that has been very common inside of institutions has now kind of climbed the institutional wall, and it can come to your home, it can go into your living room, and you can be ordered to take these drugs against your wishes. 44 USA states have involuntary outpatient commitment laws. Canada has it, England has it, Australia has it. They tend to be called community treatment orders in other areas of the world, but here we tend to call it involuntary outpatient commitment. So Erick Fabris is from Toronto, Canada, and he has authored this brand new book which is about Tranquil prisons, referring to our homes now, the chemical incarceration under community treatment orders. And Erick has been doing this work ever since he was forcibly treated in Canada, in Vancouver, back in 1993. He helped start the first Psychiatric Survivor Pride Day, kind of based on gay pride. There's now Psychiatric Survivor Pride events. And he co-founded the No Force Coalition to oppose involuntary mental health care. When he authored this book that just came out, it was used as a brief in the Supreme Court in Canada on this issue. And so he argues very, very vehemently against it because he himself has experienced forced treatment. We actually have with us, fortunately enough, an individual who has survived this approach in Australia. We will be hearing from Ryan, who's been through involuntary outpatient drugging. After we hear from Erick, Ryan will tell us what it's like to actually be on the sharp end of the needle. He was forcibly drugged at home under court order in Australia near Melbourne for 14 months, where Ryan had to come in by court order every other week and get an intramuscular injection at a clinic of these super powerful drugs. They're very controversial. We're totally pro-choice. If you personally choose to be on a psych drug, that's your choice. But those of us that have experienced the negative aspects of these super powerful so-called antipsychotic drugs or neuroleptic drugs, which are the typical ones given in a forced treatment, they can be wrecking balls to the cathedral of your mind. They can be extremely overwhelming. And now we know they can cause frontal lobe brain shrinkage in long-term use. This is not controversial. You can Google antipsychotic brain damage and just see the dozens of mainstream medical studies that long-term use can actually cause a frontal lobe shrinkage. So, but let's hear about this from an expert on it. Erick Fabris, ethnographic, author, psychiatric survivor, mad activist, and author of the brand new book, Tranquil Prisons, Chemical Incarceration Under Community Treatment Orders.
I'm going to stand up too. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, David. I'm really honored to be here, and it's a complete pleasure to be talking to students of law because in much of my work I did something called peer advocacy, which was basically group of patients and ex-patients of a particular facility getting together and hiring people to do additional advocacy on the wards. So myself and my co-worker at the time just kind of would investigate certain situations where people would complain, and we would also do systemic advocacy when it came to things like the passage of these, what would be called here involuntary outpatient committal restrictions. So through that work, I did a lot of the digging for the data in this book. It took about 9 years before I got out of that job when they finally restructured our organization right out of there. So they put something else in. The Empowerment Council actually does some pretty good work too. The work anyways gave me a sense of how patients were being dealt with on the wards, but the surprise in 2000 of new legislation that would bring additional powers, legal powers, to psychiatrists to forcibly or through legal coercions, including asking police to bring back a patient, would lead to kind of a different way of working, in my opinion, with regards to advocacy. Because we weren't looking at the issue strictly in terms of the ward itself and patients there being restricted in various ways in a controlled environment. We were now looking at the problem of patients being controlled off the ward in a non-controlled environment. So many of our predictions did come true. For example, we thought that once people would be sent out in the community this way, they would have even less of a chance to connect with each other and connect with advocates because of the fact that nobody would really know what their status was, their legal status under in Ontario, it's the Mental Health Act. I'm not sure what your law is in Oregon, but pretty much in every state or province here in North America, there's also Australian states, there's also national jurisdictions like the United Kingdom have passed these kinds of laws within the last, since at least 1978, throughout the 80s and especially during the 90s. But the end results of all of this were that we needed to do the work that we did differently. So once I eventually got out of Queen Street, the facility I was in, working, what I was faced with was this problematic of not knowing how our folks were being dealt with in the community. And one of the things I thought I might try is, now that I was out of a job and I was trying to find other work, was maybe I should go back to school. And that gave me a chance to take all the stuff that I had learned, investigate further in certain respects, such as, for example, a lot of the stuff in here will deal with medical literature, legal literature, historical literature, and try to give some framework to why these laws exist, how they developed, and where people are going with them. Having done all that, I was able to sort of look at, investigate actual stories of people's experiences under community treatment orders, which here would be called involuntary outpatient committal. So in every state and province that deploys these mechanisms, you're going to find very similar stories. When we did our radio show this morning, Ryan was talking about his own experiences and situations that he'd seen in Australia, and they very much reflected the things that I heard about on the ground, as it were. I didn't actually interview for my research people who were under community treatment orders because I felt that not only are they under duress and might not be able to answer honestly, but they also might be compromised in terms of cognitive capacities by the medications, so-called, that they were being put on. So I felt that this was a very vulnerable group in various respects, not only emotionally, but also legally, right? So whatever they might have said to me might have been a problem. So what I did instead was I turned the ethnographic or sociological gaze onto the staff and asked them about all of this. Which was actually interesting because very few people wanted to even discuss these implements. I think I got feedback from something like 3 people in the first month, quietly came forward and said, I'd like to know more about this. And many of these people were very progressive themselves, but hadn't talked to each other about what was going on. So we got a chance to actually put some of these perceptions together, and that grew forward, and more people started to come forward to the tune of something like 9 or 10 people. Right? So again, very, very controversial law, but one that is not very well understood, and that's why I needed to write this book on this particular psychiatric methodology. If I restrained myself to the question of involuntary incarceration, I probably wouldn't get much more on that issue than many people have written on that issue. So I just thought, what about these new laws that are coming out? What makes them so controversial? So the whole point of the book is to try to show how psychiatric methodologies have moved, and practices have moved from very site-based kinds of controls, such as the asylums of the past that were getting run down over the course of the last century, so they had to close a lot of them down. Many people still believe that the medications were a reason why those facilities were closed down in the 50s through into the 90s. But as Andrew Scull shows us, those closures were happening in the 1940s simply for economic reasons. Right? The medications that were introduced in the 50s were very were not studied very well. Within a few, something like 12 to 13 months, they were dispensing these medications on hundreds of people in the US. And the only thing they had going for them was that they noticed that when they experimented with mice, mice would not be put to sleep. They would still be walking around, but they'd be much more controlled, much more simply kind of sedated. Right? So they thought, well, maybe this would be good for the psychiatric inpatient population at that time. And sure enough, people were being managed better under these new tranquilizers, then nobody really knew how they worked. But what they found, as Scull shows us, when they released people into the community, nobody could really do much out there because, of course, they were being dampened cognitively, emotionally, and so on into a situation where they couldn't make decisions very easily. You might be saying, well, come on, they couldn't make decisions while they were supposedly ill. So how could they, what's the difference? And of course, the difference is that one is an imposition by social society, and the other is, of course, something that society could try to work around, could try to accommodate in a disability kind of sense. So one is simply a state control method, whereas the other is simply something that we're dealing with in our everyday lives. So when the state decides that the site, the asylum, is no longer useful, it turns to other techniques and technologies. So very soon after that, they found out how these drugs work, essentially by reducing the dopamine system flow to the tune of some 80%. So much of the dopamine that's flowing through your central nervous system gets reduced by a great margin in order to get that therapeutic effect, which back in the 60s, they started to call Parkinsonian therapeutism. In other words, when they found out that they'd reduced dopamine to that degree, they recognized that this was very much like Parkinson's disease, and felt that Parkinson's was kind of like on the other side of schizophrenia, say, right? Or any psychotic illness. And what they figured was, well, the ideal would be to induce a Parkinsonian type of solution to the problem of psychosis. This was very, they were proudly saying that this was a chemical lobotomy at the time, that it was Parkinsonian therapy. So that hasn't changed, despite the fact that many people feel that the medications have improved over the years. The second generation of drugs that were introduced during the 70s and 80s have very much the same chemical compounds, slightly modified. There are new problematic effects, as the National Institute for Mental Health found. This is not a friend to survivors, this organization. Within 18 months, some 1,500 people, very willing participants, wanted to decrease some of their problems in life, and looked to this study as a possibility. They compared the old drug of haldopridol, which I was put under when I first got into the system, with some of the newer medications, 3 of the newer medications. After 18 months, what they found was that, I always ask my classes to guess at the number of people who stayed on the medications. And they're usually, you know, 80, 50%, maybe some will go as low as 30% because that's placebo, right? You know, usually placebos will work as well as medications that don't work at about 30% of people. Well, it was lower than that. And again, this is the National Institute for Mental Health, it's not me. You know, they're saying only 25% of people, not only in the old drugs, but in the new drugs, were rejecting these, or were staying on these medications because they felt that it might help. The other 75% cited major negative effects that made it difficult for them to live and to be capable in the world, or they just simply didn't work, so they let it go. So you have this kind of, and now there's a third generation, by the way, of neuroleptic major tranquilizers, and those haven't been studied to that degree, but the anecdotal evidence suggests very much the same kinds of issues. Weight gain, rapid weight gain, you know, there could be tardive dyskinesias where you have shakes. So there's all these negative effects, and we're not even talking about things like the reduction of your life expectancy by about 25 years if you stay on this stuff, right? If you look at Robert Whitaker's book, you can really get into some of this, because I'm not an expert in the psychopharmacology area, but he definitely takes up this question. He cites the memos from the companies and the Psychiatric Association. He looks at it in a more journalistic and historical fashion, whereas maybe somebody like Peter Bregan would look at it more in terms of psychotropics, right? So, given that they're not exactly the safest and most effective medications on the market, why are they being forced on people?
Money.
When I interviewed a psychiatrist in Ontario, she said that, look, that's the best we have going. That's the limits of our science today. And so we have to try some, you know, with something. We have to you know, try the best we can. So from the perspective of someone who does care about the patient, the idea is that although these drugs are very limited, there's no interest in trying to maybe, you know, lower the dosage, for example, so that you don't have many of the difficult reactions. There's no attempt to, sometimes they just up the dosage, sometimes they add new other drugs as well, polypharmacy it's called. You know, so there's this sort of idea that these drugs are kind of like, a little bit like vitamins. You can just simply add more and hope for the best results, or just change them. You know, somebody's getting used to one drug, then all of a sudden it gets taken out of their body, something else gets put in. You can imagine the difficult problems in the body that this would generate. The work that I did then took actual experiences as perceived by psychiatric workers in Ontario, and found that with this problem with the medications themselves as a kind of a focal point, there were numerous social and legal moves or interventions being made into people's lives, fully based on the idea that these medications are safe and effective, very much like the medical establishment tells us they are. Right? I mean, when the National Institute for Mental Health found out that only 25% of people would stay on these drugs, did they, Robert Whitaker asked an audience, did they trumpet this to the public? Did they let people know? Of course not. They buried it into the back pages and very quietly tried to move away from those findings. So there's no issue of spin. There's just a problem of hiding any information that might distract the public from taking these drugs as safe and effective. So what's to be done if they're not safe and effective, but it's the only tool that we have to manage what we would call mental distress, what some would call mental disorder, and some would go further and call it a genetic biological disease. Well, and this is all based on supposition, of course. You might have read many books that say, no, it's very well proven that we know exactly what's going on in the body when these behaviors arise. We know exactly why people hallucinate. We know why they're deluded. And of course, these are, kind of backwards arguments, because those are the experiences of the phenomena that we see in social situations. We try to explain it physically if we can. We, have Western science that has tried to look for the markers that would indicate a genetic disposition towards this, that would indicate a chemical imbalance, that would indicate any of the sort of major theories that have been posited as the cause for these unnatural behaviors. And of course, why would they be unnatural if they're happening, if they've happened for centuries? In any case, the only things that we've tried so far have been social interventions, interactions. The studies that have been done on those social interactions have shown us that they're far more successful than psychiatric medications, either alone or in conjunct with therapies. So with that knowledge, you look at Soteria House by Lauren Mosher, who used to head the American Psychiatric Association. You look at the Finland studies that have been done on a whole community, where they got a whole community to talk about these issues, and within something like 5 or 10 years, they reduced the phenomenon of madness, or what I would just call distress, natural distress, by something like from 30 down to 5% of the population had these experiences. So you can see the impact that social interactions have, but again, we're trying to force these medications under the belief that they're safe and effective, and we're doing it with a sort of social sense of purpose that is unmatched in almost any other modern Western kind of push for health, right? Because we're not only demanding, say, that someone who's supposedly overweight should do something about this by exercising or going to consult a doctor. We're actually trying to impose medications in such a way that we require legal interventions in order to make sure that those impositions or interventions get made, right, get done. So that's what this book is about, is looking at, we used to lock people up in facilities and cells, prisons, whatnot. But Richard Lovelace, a poet from the 17th century, once said, bars and bricks do not a prison make. And I think what he meant by this was that basically it's the ostracization of people, it's the division of people from, into sound and mad that really propels the idea of incarceration, of keeping someone out of social interactions, supposedly for their own good. That's the other story or narrative that we're given, is that, okay, whether or not we know that this is a disease, whether or not the medications work or the electroshock or whatever we have, what we do know is that people are scared of it, people don't have a good time of it, and of course there's many stories of people saying, actually there's some really positive parts to that experience. We know that it's a very troubling thing, so we have to manage that person. We have to contain that person. There's no other way, right? And of course we're ignoring much of the other evidence. So those three mythologies, that the drugs are safe and effective, that there is no other way to control a body that is behaving this way, and that this is probably due to a a physical illness that we simply don't have markers for yet, but we have many theories about, are many of the precipitating factors behind this kind of work, this kind of psychiatric work. So this book then, to just conclude this piece, was an attempt to show how treatment and therapy were ways of talking about what we do with people in the psychiatric system, so that we don't recognize the other things we do, such as restraints, or in this case, legal constraints to keep someone on medications. We tend to push those things aside in order to look at the therapeutic values of treatments. So we'll weigh certain treatments, like electroshock, for example, and we'll study electroshock. Well, we'll probably ignore most of the evidence, but we'll pretend to at least study it and say, for some people it works. For some people, even though they experience memory loss, even though they experience brain damage, it works for them. And they will say so. Just like, victims in the 19th century would tell you, oh yes, I'm a child laborer and I love my job. It's the thing where you have already victimized the person, then you go to them with a microphone and you ask them, so how did that work for you? Well, there's plenty of reasons why they're going to say it really did work, I loved it, thank you very much. And the reasons are that you're trying to stay away from more coercion, right? So, despite the fact that I don't believe everybody is just hoodwinked, and that some people do believe that they benefit from the labels and the drugs, most people certainly feel that they don't, right? Most people would have wanted, for example, a softer, first interaction with the system, right? Just a little bit of talk, right? A little bit of communication with other people like themselves, perhaps, or even some people that are a little different so that they can kind of get a sense of themselves. That doesn't happen, in our experiences. So all these hopes that the system would provide different kinds of therapies fall back into these questions of coercion. So the therapeutic language definitely gets us away from the coercion issue, gets us away from the penological or criminological language of the system, such as chemical restraint. That's a term that's used by psychiatrists. When you look at chemical restraint, and you look at something like the involuntary outpatient committal, what you notice is that what they're trying to do is legally constrain a body over a period of time. My argument in this book, which was sent to the Supreme Court of Canada, is that if you do that, you're essentially extending a carceratory method for a long period of time that is not consistent with constitutional standards, right? You're not supposed to just destroy a body in order to manage it, right? At least prisoners have the right to, retain their brain, retain their mind, because they're seen as cogent people who make decisions, sometimes bad decisions. But with psychiatric inmates, or what I would call detainees because we don't have the rights of inmates, it's not quite that easy. Essentially, the person is not allowed to make those decisions, and it is all about coercion and management of that body. But the problem is that most of us talk about it in terms of therapy because they, of course, are legally or socially considered a mental patient. Never mind what the mental means. They're a patient. So that hyperbole or rhetoric of healthcare gets in the way of investigating and researching the constraints and restraints that we use on bodies and what the effects of those maneuvers are. And certainly, if we start to look at the effects of those interventions, we would notice that they probably bring recovery rates down. We would notice that they probably hamper people's attempts to get along with their environments. And they slow down interactions between them and others. That was one of my pressing arguments, was that much like a prison, drugging essentially limits a person's ability to communicate with others and also limits their bodily movement. Like when I was on the drugs, I could barely, I would be kind of like wooden in my movements. There was a lot of problems with my perception, and so on and so forth. So you're being detained within your body, or as medicine would call it, in vivo. And that is a maneuver that is scary to most of us because it's so hard to kind of pin down the exact physical method that that's being done with. Right? At least with a prison, you can say, there's the four walls. If you take those down and release the prisoner, that's the end of the incarceration. But in this case, you could get drugged once, and you could be basically stuck on that drug for years and years because you're essentially trying to avoid any withdrawal reactions, and so on. So if we're looking at the constraints and restraints of patients, we might turn to the question of advocacy and the law. Don't forget that the history of the madness trade is very long in the West and has many problematic periods. And it has culminated in the asylum culture of the 19th century and finally in the chemicalization of the 20th century. This frames our understanding of the legal rights of those persons who are being detained in this way. We certainly see them as supplicants, as patients in need of therapy. We don't consider that perhaps they're just natural human beings like everybody else. Everybody goes through different kinds of distress, including seeing things. We don't think in those terms. We simply think in terms that, are they capable to walk out, do their banking, do all the things that everybody else is supposed to do? And if they're not, we would just simply consider them patients because they're not criminals in the sense of they've already committed a crime. But as we were discussing a little earlier, they're probably they might commit a crime. They might become violent. We don't know. This is the mythology. We read those those singular anecdotes about the person who does something violent, and we take that to be the norm because we don't know about this population because of the history. They've been locked away, sent out of the central spaces, and essentially not listened to, not considered. So what can be done about this issue is maybe something that we can talk about today when we get to more of the question and answer period. There are a number of possibilities, I suppose, but you know, a lot of it, to my mind, has to do with reflecting on the realities of people's lives and stories, and looking at their experiences as more than simply hearsay about somebody who has no mind, right? Who has no capacity whatsoever. We tend to think in those you know, terms of capacity as either you have it or you don't, right, in law. We don't tend to think in terms of capacity as something that's shared between us. For example, having these two guys here supports me in talking, even though I'm still you know, nervous. You know, we share each other's strengths and weaknesses. And when we look at capacity law, we usually think in terms of a singular individual and whether they are able to surmount the standards that we have of all individuals in society. Perhaps we should look at capacities in terms of shared responsibilities. For example, does the state eschew its responsibilities when it pretends away all this evidence about the ineffectiveness and unsafety of medications? Shouldn't the state have some kind of standard of its own? So, you know, these issues of capacity that really ground these practices, it's because of people's incapacity that we're scared that they might do something wrong. It's because of their incapacity that we don't want to really hear them out and think that they're incapable of thinking along our lines. And it's because of incapacity that we basically stop the policy discussions that could be had, right? This all informs how we presently, in the 21st century, are moving ahead with the, you know, the idea of psychopharmaceutical interventions for any kinds of distress. Right? So you'll hear stories about psychologists being flown into Sri Lanka or you know, into the, I think it was 2006 tidal wave. I can't remember the location, Thailand, perhaps.
Sri Lanka? You mean the one in Sri Lanka and other countries around there?
Yeah, I can't remember the center, but people were you know, out of their houses and stuff, and you know, in come the psychologists to help them out. It's like, where's the social, the consideration of sociological issues? Where's the, you know, where are the politics? Where are the economics to this devastation and people suffering? That's not on the playlist for most mental health workers and therapists. Not to say there aren't, by the way. I'm not wanting to demonize mental health workers. In all of my interviews, I found that many of them were concerned about the issues of over-drugging. They simply didn't have any outlets. They had no way of communicating with each other as a way of protest, or you know, if they did protest, they'd be censured for it, and so on. So there's a number of different issues here that, you know, I'm not necessarily directly alluding to, but there's lots of possibilities in terms of how we can strengthen our, you know, everyone's resistance to simply being, you know, having companies throw medications down our throats and hoping for the best, if you give them credit. But probably, you know, all they're really worried about is getting product out, right? Produce is the worker sensibility. Make sure they stay on their meds. Make sure they stay on. That was talked about quite a bit in terms of workers kind of not snitching, but informing us, the public, about how they talk in meetings and stuff. It's all about making sure that people are compliant with their medication regime, and it's all about making sure that people understand that their decisions are being made for them because they can't make it themselves. This is the narrative. Now, I'm just going to conclude all this by reading a bit from the book, so you get an idea that this is not quite as academic-y as I'm making it sound here. I'm really, you know, hoping to tweak some ideas in your advocacy minds and give you an idea of where the struggle comes from for me and maybe for others in terms of capacity law and how that translates into carceratory measures. But there's also a human edge to this that very often gets left aside because we're so, you know, overwhelmed by the stories that we hear. I'll wait till a little bit later for my fellow panelists to tell you a few of those stories. I just want to, you know, for one example, in the research I did, a legal worker at a legal clinic talked to me about clients of hers that had come in as refugee claimants. And her story was, they come in, they have gone through some really difficult times back home, and what happens is they need a chance or a space to grieve. They need a place to cry. They need to let go of some of this tension. And what happens is, of course, when they go seeking help, they find themselves in the mental health system very quickly. And then, of course, they're simply drugged. And because if somebody says to you, I've been seeing things as a result of what happened to me, well, that just means you're schizophrenic. Not everybody who goes through this will have the same exact experience as you, so you must be what we would call schizophrenic, or bipolar affective disorder, whatever, some psychotic disorder. So these people are being treated. They sometimes resist the treatment and get put on a community treatment order. At this point, this legal worker is saying, what I heard these folks say was, when they were at the bottom of this well, they would ask to be deported. They would ask to be sent back to their home country, where they were sure to experience the same kinds of violence that they had experienced before. So she said it should concern us that people feel that the torture that they experience under the mental health system in Ontario, or anywhere else for that matter, is worse to people than the physical assaults that they might experience, or the danger of death even in some war-torn situations. And that tells you something about how important it is for us to have our own minds, how important it is for us to at least feel that society gives us the benefit of the doubt that we can make many of our own decisions, if not all. Again, much of our decision-making process is shared, right? But if we look at that as a problem, the fact that society will take away our power to decide, but even our power to think, right? Our cognitive capacity, in order to manage some problem that is seen as chronic, lifelong. That's what I was told. You will have this illness for the rest of your life. It's completely disabling. You will not be able to work. You will not have relationships. Right? You'll never fall in love anymore. Blah blah blah. This is the stuff that we're being told, and this is the treatment for it. It's good treatment. Whatever treatment works. We'll try this drug. We'll try that drug. We'll try another drug. So I'll just finish up here by reading a little bit from this, just so that you know that even though there's a lot of data behind all of this, there's also the issue of lived experience, right? So the whole book was actually written as a narrative because I got in with some professors in sociology who were more into narrative as the means of presenting information. But also because narrative gives us a way of talking with each other that doesn't necessarily depend on facts, or depend on, and I'm not saying that facts should be ignored, but rather that the facts are part of the story. It's not the other way around, that the story is just a kind of an intermediary positioning inside of the facts. Anyways, let me show you what I mean. Let me just find So this is in a chapter called biocarceration, because I think that this won't stop at drugging or electroshock. They'll come up with different modes of controlling bodies in the future. So I'm thinking it's all carceratory practices anyways, so I call this particular chapter biocarceration. This is the story about when I got out of Vancouver's General Hospital as a drugged mental patient and got back to Toronto, sort of my hometown, after only a few months. Tail between my legs, kind of go back to my hometown, and sort of what it was like to live in a state of being drugged and being put back into your sort of normal abode, where everything's supposed to just kind of fall back into order. So this section I'll read is called Segregation Without Walls. Toronto is much colder than I ever remembered. I realize I'm no longer the same person. I'm still saying to my family, incessantly it seems, that I need to get better and hopefully reduce my medications. It is causing me to feel nothing, I say, and my thinking is too slow for me to find work. I try to draw, and my concentration falls apart very quickly. I try to remember the chords to my songs. I try to write, but and I can barely remember the chords to my songs. I try to write, but I have nothing in me, nothing that I care about. I try to set up an action plan on finding work, but I find myself going in circles, small circles. I meet a couple of psychiatrists who are nice, but one of them is too smart with the symbols, and the other one works in a hospital, and I can't stand the memory of the hospital. I see a dentist. He explains that the swelling of my gums and the lack of saliva in my mouth are a side effect that will get worse. I will have to be extra vigilant to delay the inevitable loss of my teeth. Everything means less and less, because I don't feel it long enough, if at all. Each moment is broken from the last, and without any feeling, the story ceases to impress upon me. I can speak and listen, but it's bland, empty. Any emphasis is an extra effort. When I talk, I have very little to say, and people lose interest. I read a paragraph or two and forget what I read. I'm watching this happen. My partner and my family talk about things that matter to them, that used to matter to me, but I'm not engaged at all. One day, my roommate asks to try a half dose of my loxapine. He is 5 feet 10 inches tall, 170 pounds, a drinker and smoker. He returns in 1 hour saying he can't stay awake. He sleeps for 36 hours and is somewhat lost when he awakens. I walk up the street spending my daily government allotment on a falafel. I am never noticed on the street, even though I feel like the walking dead, and I avoid being noticed. Weeks pass and nothing changes, including my halting determination to get off the drugs. A psychologist friend says, "You don't have to stay on that shit, you know. They can't make you take it." And it's true. Yet my hospital education says otherwise. I remember my doctor's word, relapse. I never want to relapse, to be taken back into a hospital because I stopped taking my medication and went mad. I still think weird thoughts, but they're under control. I fantasize that, against the odds, I will live a somewhat normal life someday. Others are cheery about this prospect. One day, 4 months after my hospitalization, my partner walks in and she says she has to leave me. I'm doing my laundry, and though I hear what she's saying, I don't feel anything. I try to think back to our time together, but no image comes to mind, no conversation or event. I try to feel a connection to her, but nothing. I feel nothing. My intellect is telling me this is important, but my mind tends to float to other concerns. I concern myself with the immediate task of sorting the socks. She stares at me. Sensing that she is waiting for a response, I apologize. "Sorry, I wish I knew what to say." My face shows undead calm. My partner of 2 years starts crying uncontrollably, like she never has before. I remember to stay grounded, like the nurse said, to not stress myself. But I empathize with her. She's a stranger who has dropped a bag of vegetables. I wish there was something I could say, I repeat. It's not that I don't care, it's just that there's nothing to say. But how can I explain that? How can I tell her that I can't feel when I don't care enough to notice that I can't feel? I am living in an emotional absence, aware mostly of time passing away. After she leaves, I tell my brother and his partner, and they are genuinely concerned. I tell them like I'm reporting something, an event on the news, and they are the ones who feel for me. After a moment has passed, they also get nothing from my reaction, and the conversation turns to the usual. The family goes back to discussions in which there is emotion, even riotous emotion later in the evening. I try to join in, speaking slowly or haltingly as I try to think fast. It's not that I'm a sad figure or too crazy to make sense of. It's not that they dislike the new me. It's me, after all. And they will come to accept how I am eventually. They already have in some ways. It is that I am not there. It is that I am not about me, not interested in myself. I'm still playing the object, doing the work of the mental patient, which is to stay out of trouble. My life has shrunk before my eyes. I stare with detachment at my patient self. Dishes are cleared and washed, and the television's back on. But in another month, my former partner will show me a pamphlet that reads, "Proud to be crazy." And I will go to my first meeting with a group of psychiatric survivors. With their help, I will gain the courage to ask my shrink to let me decrease the loxapine by 5 milligrams every 3 weeks. It will seem harrowing at first, as my brain starts getting environmental messages again. By August, I will have gone off all my drugs, started working, and found new friendships to last a lifetime. Conclusion to chapter 6. I wanted to tell you that story because it's all fine to hear about the systemic issues that kind of ground these issues and lead us to think about, you know, what possible ways might we tackle them through our institutions. But I think it's impossible to tackle them without knowing a little bit about the experiences of people who are being drugged or who have been contained in other ways. So I'm hoping that that gives you a sense of the book, because I think the book is very much along, a narrative in those terms. It wants to tell a story, but it packs that story in with a whole bunch of graduate research on coercion, linkages between violence and supposed mental illness, number of issues of the medications and so on. So again, the question is, how can we communicate about these issues in ways that actually matter to each of us? And I think the way to do that is through stories. But I also think, and conversations, but I also think that we also have a responsibility to try to face these challenges because they are challenges to our society. We're trying to basically quell emotion. We're trying to quell distress. And while sometimes I like to quell my own emotion, that's a choice, right? That's not somebody else telling me that I need to quell my emotions, especially without any support whatsoever, right? Without any, proffering of talk therapy and so on. So, putting that out there, I'm going to conclude my presentation, and maybe David.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Eric.